So 1983 is where we're going to begin. As we can see here, this was the episode in which President Ronald Reagan took an unprecedented step in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, denouncing that nation as an evil empire utterly devoid of legitimacy. This was a groundbreaking moment because it was the first time since 1933 when the United States first extended diplomatic recognition to the Soviets that a sitting American president had publicly denied the right of the USSR to even exist. Now, of course, President Reagan was speaking from his position not only as a president, but as a longtime sort of inveterate Cold Warrior who hoped to triumph over communism through bellicose rhetoric and renewed brinkmanship. But in the past 3 decades, historians have dealt very seriously with the question of whether the USSR was a de facto empire, in fact. In my paper, Ruins of the Evil Empire, asks this question, poses it to the historians of the period, and asks if the USSR was a de facto empire, how can that be reconciled with its ostensibly revolutionary ideology? So fundamental to any empire are its ideological underpinnings, of course. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor under the Carter administration, outlines the rise and fall of the Soviet Union through the lens of imperialism in his book, The Grand Failure, in which he labels communism an extraordinary political and intellectual aberration whose philosophy flew in the face of historical fact, contemporary reality, and most importantly for Brzezinski, human nature. The Soviet Union's socialist economy deviated, in his opinion, from the basic human need to compete in the marketplace. He argues that the imperial foundation of the regime was twofold. It involved, first, the repression of national identity throughout the USSR, including, of course, Russian national identity, and second, the establishment of a police state apparatus. Furthermore, he argues that the early productivity and tremendous growth of the Soviet economy was due only to the murderous efficiency of this imperialist groundwork. And once Nikita Khrushchev introduced de-Stalinization in the 1950s, closing down the gulags, dissolving the firing squads, the natural backwardness of socialism started to reassert itself. And according to Brzezinski, the Soviet state was doomed as soon as its basic imperial system of oppression was dismantled under Khrushchev. Closely linked to this argument is that of Russian historian Ilya Zemtsov, who argues that the Soviet Union was akin to in his words, a biological organism with a remarkably effective immunological system. The Gulag, the purges, and the state terror obviously forming the foundation of that immunological system. To use his analogy, the larger the virus of opposition or dissent against communist rule, the fiercer the struggle put up by that immune system, and the harder it came down on possible dissidents. Where Zemtsov departs substantially from Brzezinski's interpretation that I just discussed is that for him it was Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, not Nikita Khrushchev's, that were fundamental to undermining the Soviet state. Even though Khrushchev removed overt terror from the system of Soviet governance in the 1950s, the essential elements of Stalinism never really went away, at least not until 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the general secretary. Even without state violence, the immunological system was retained through the repression of national identity, similar to Brzezinski's argument, the dissemination of state propaganda, and state control as well over higher education. The real key to the fall of communism in Russia, according to Zemtsov, was Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, and above all, his aversion to the use of state force. So if the Soviet Union was an empire, key to its survival was the willingness and ability to use force against its subjects. This was displayed not only in the purges of Stalin's rule, but also, of course, during the Soviet interventions in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, Afghanistan in 1979, and others. According to both Zemtsov and Brzezinski, the Brezhnev Doctrine, which justified these and other interventions in other communist countries, was merely the Soviet version of the age-old right claimed by imperial powers for centuries to oversee matters in their own empires as they saw fit, without interference from anyone else. With Gorbachev at the helm in the Kremlin, though, that equation suddenly changed. Not only did he refuse to kill his opponents or jail his opponents, be they opponents in the Kremlin or in the streets of Moscow, he refused to intervene even after 1988 when the forces of ethnic genocide, barbarism, and chaos began to tear the Soviet Union apart. Of course, as convincing as we may find this framework of understanding the Soviet Union as an empire, from Zemstov and Brzezinski's perspectives, there remain elementary flaws in the logic. First, Brzezinski, I think, is correct enough in his analysis of Stalin's domestic politics. But the Kremlin dictator's foreign policy is a lot more complicated. Certain historians, such as Simon Sebag Montefiore, have made much of certain elements of the past, such as Stalin's bookshelves containing biographies of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, and the supposed influence that exerted on Stalin and his leadership. And it is true that in many aspects Stalin did act as a quintessential imperialist would have. For example, when he split up Poland with Hitler, after the Nazi-Soviet pact, trying to carve up spheres of influence in the Middle East in competition with the Allies, or when he tried to establish a protectorate in Libya at the end of the Second World War. But even though these examples abound, even at his most calculating, Stalin also spent a great deal of the Kremlin treasury subsidizing what could only be called genuine revolutionary movements around the world. There's some degree of irony in that fact, and in the fact that the Marxist-Leninist USSR would eventually become one of the most potent anti-imperialist forces in history. Of course, Karl Marx was ambivalent on the issue of colonialism, and if anything, he seems to have been at least implicitly supportive of European control over societies that he would have considered unfit for self-rule, not necessarily because of racism as in other people of his time, but because of their economic underdevelopment, their unreadiness for self-rule. In the Russian tradition, it was not until the rise of Lenin and Trotsky to power that communist thought became closely linked to the crusade against colonialism. In Rise of Global Powers, Professor Anthony D'Agostino, with whom I've had the pleasure of working in my university, outlines the early Bolshevik regime's anti-colonial efforts. According to D'Agostino, the revolutionary ideology of the Soviet leadership was solidified in the crucible of the period between 1918 and 1924, when the civil war in Russia, the Allied intervention, and the breakaway of former Russian imperial provinces threatened to overwhelm the first communist regime in the world. Of course, the Bolsheviks were radical long before they came to power in 1917, but the important development that D'Agostino traces in his book, Rise of Global Powers, is the fusing of Marxist internationalism with a commitment to actually holding power in one state in the short term. To the Soviets, there was no contradiction between holding power in one state in the short term and believing in the eventuality of world revolution. Another issue to address, in addition to the contradiction between revolution and empire, is the qualm that it's difficult to call the Soviet Union an empire with a straight face when, in reality, the standard of living of the alleged metropole of the Soviet Union was far lower than that of its alleged colonies, most notably in East Germany. It strains the imagination to think of another historical example of a de facto or de jure empire where the subjects were living in a better living standard than were their oppressors. Not only were average East Europeans living high on the hog compared to their Soviet counterparts, in fact, the Soviet state poured enormous financial and natural resources into subsidizing those domestic economies in the Eastern Bloc. Which begs the question, why did the Soviet Union spend so much of its treasure, greatly contributing to its ruinous finances, to subsidize communism around the world? What was the basis, the rationale for that commitment? In the case of the Warsaw Pact nations, Professor D'Agostino argues that Soviet leaders found themselves unable to shake Stalin's sort of obsolete 19th century conception of state security as based on a series of buffer zones, protecting one's nation from possible opponents. Moreover, obviously on the domestic front, it was very politically dangerous for a Soviet leader to open himself up to the accusation of losing one of the satellite communist states. That would be dangerous politically, if not fatal, for any leader. But when we consider the overseas client states that Moscow was spending so much money supporting and contributed little to no strategic value to the Soviet Union, we have to look once again at ideology for a little bit more of an acceptable explanation. This comes to the question of whether the Soviet leadership believed in their own communist faith, which is something historians have dealt with. On the superficial level, of course, we can point to the petty hypocrisy of Soviet leaders. These alleged heads of the international proletariat spent their leisure time, being whisked around in luxury automobiles by chauffeurs, dining in their opulent dakas, and enjoying pretty much all of the material excesses of the richest Western capitalists. Moreover, there's a temptation to dismiss communist ideology in the case of the Soviet Empire as a perfidious cover for state interests. Many in the Academy did so during the Cold War, and of course many historians continue to do so today. But I don't believe we should let the cynicism of our postmodern age preclude for us the possibility that human beings, even statesmen, sometimes believe what they say, and that ideological pronouncements, even on the forked tongue of a communist, can have historical value. In every polity known to history, of course, there's always been a discrepancy between ideas and practice, not least in our own nation. It's only natural that discrepancy, that gulf, should be greatest in countries whose governance is based on superlatively utopian ideals, such as the Soviet Union. So that begs the question, how can we square the circle, so to speak, of the contradiction between imperialist and revolutionary tendencies? Which brings us to Vladislav Zubok, whose recent book, A Failed Empire, gives us an excellent conceptual tool for understanding and making some sense of this question. In his accounting of Soviet history, from the creation of the Soviet state under Lenin, revolutionary ardor and imperialist motivation were intertwined as the Soviet leadership combined their very idealistic view of the future of the international working class with a superlatively cynical view of the balance of power, politics, and capitalistic Europe. Indeed, the Soviets wanted to beat the West at its own game, and Stalin continued this tradition of extreme realpolitik with a very great Machiavellianism that's largely unknown to history. But as the Soviet Union expanded its empire into Eastern Europe, in Zubok's accounting, and began to take on revolutionary client states throughout the world, the post-Stalin leadership in the Kremlin was forced once again to reconcile state imperialism with Bolshevik revolutionism. This led to the paradigm that Zubok calls the revolutionary imperial paradigm, that he finds to have been the defining feature of Soviet foreign policy from Stalin's time all the way until Gorbachev. So as you can see in the subtitle, from Stalin to Gorbachev. Perhaps the contours of this debate are well demonstrated by a case study, an excellent example of which is the civil war in Angola in the 1970s. Professor D'Agostino examines the Soviet-Cuban joint intervention there when the Blue Sea Fleet of the Soviet Union was combined with their overseas naval bases to transport Cuban soldiers to fight alongside the communist MPLA in Angola. And examining this, D'Agostino finds an example to support his thesis of the Soviets fighting a genuinely anti-imperialistic struggle. On the other hand, when Zemtsov examines the same episode, he classifies this episode as two empires, American and Soviet, squabbling over a colonial mandate basically in the 19th century fashion, while Brzezinski sees the communists as using their ideology as a cover to expand in the Third World. Between these two schools, with D'Agostino on the one hand seeing the revolutionary quality of the Soviet leadership, Zemstvo and Brzezinski, as I mentioned, being a little more cynical in their view of what really motivated the Soviets. Between these two, Zubov classifies this as a prime example of his revolutionary imperial paradigm. According to him, after Stalin's death, Soviet leaders became, in his words, prisoners of the contradiction of their own ideology. And basically, they were unable to shake the support for worldwide revolution that they had been committed to by this paradigm, the revolutionary imperial paradigm. To conclude, I think the greatest weakness of Zubov's argument is that he applies it exclusively to the Soviet Union. If we were to find that conceptual tool of the revolutionary imperial paradigm a useful one, and I believe that it can be a useful one, I think it's important to put it in sort of proper historical context. I believe this begins in 1793 with the French Revolutionary Wars. During those French Revolutionary Wars, the armies of France spread the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity under the tricolor banner, but also, of course, at the point of bayonets throughout Europe. The French Revolution, I think we can agree, of 1789 was, unlike our own American Revolution, a social upheaval as well as a political one, not just a political revolution, but an overall social upheaval. And the French Revolution introduced the paradox of a revolutionary government that found itself inheriting imperial possessions, not necessarily knowing what to do with them. For example, in the case of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti as we know it today. And really being poised, in fact, militarily to take on more imperial possessions, and furthermore, not to know what to do with that either. The French armies were imperialists, conquering territory and carving up vassal states across the face of the European continent, but they also brought with them, of course, the seed of social revolution, be it the abolition of feudalism, the establishment of state secularism, or the ideology of interclass nationalism as a replacement for monarchical legitimacy or popular loyalty to the sovereign. And the French armies, of course, were not the last to find themselves in such a contradictory position between 1793 and 1917, when the Soviet Union came to exist. Other examples abound. In the 19th century, the British obviously exploited and brutally repressed the Africans they ruled, but they also taught them about the Glorious Revolution and told them, I don't believe completely unearnestly, that one day they would be ready to rule themselves. In the Wilmine era, the Germans used brute force to attain their coveted place of the sun in Europe, but they also did revolutionary things such as planting the seed of revolutionary Arab nationalism throughout the holdings of the Ottoman Empire. And I think in the same vein, the Soviets used the tactics of imperialism to expand in the Third World while spreading genuinely revolutionary ideals. I believe that if properly defined, Zubov's revolutionary imperial paradigm is specific neither to the Cold War nor to the Soviet Union, but is an integral part of the era in which we have all lived since the French Revolution dragged an unwilling Europe into the modern age. Thank you.